All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 21, Section 4, Progressivism in the White House. So Theodore Roosevelt was the first progressive president. So first progressive president. That for the most part, the federal government, and again, we had mentioned this in some of the previous chapters, was that the progressive movement spread from local to state to the federal government, and the federal government was kind of the last part of the government to respond to really this progressive impulse. And so when Roosevelt became president in 1901, this was the first time that you had someone who was reform-minded in the most powerful and highest office in the land. Now, Roosevelt himself actually came to that position via an assassination. The president prior, William McKinley, was assassinated. This is actually a photo of McKinley being shot. Teddy Roosevelt, who you see pictured right here, was the vice president, then became president. And of course, a lot of those politicians that were not reform-minded remarked, that damn cowboy is now president, meaning that here was a guy with a lot of these, what most traditional politicians might think as radical ideas, progressive ideas, was now in charge. And as soon as Roosevelt assumed the presidency via being the vice president and then filling in for McKinley, who was shot and killed, then began to enact his progressive agenda. The Department of Commerce and Labor was established by Roosevelt. This was to investigate trusts. Again, recall trusts were really centers of economic power. A trust was a group of investors who owned multiple companies and were able to exercise pretty much monopolistic power. That is, they're the only people in that industry to produce and therefore can charge whatever prices that they want. And so these trusts, or these entities of groups of investors, groups of owners, really came to represent and symbol or became a symbol of centralized economic power. And that's essentially what Roosevelt set out to do by, quote unquote, busting the trust. He was successful in breaking up the Northern Securities Company in 1904. So Roosevelt broke up this trust, which included people like J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller, who were amongst the most powerful people in the country economically and even politically. And so for this, Roosevelt earned the nickname the Trust Buster. He was known for being this president who was willing to take on big business. However, Roosevelt distinguished between good trusts and bad trusts, that there were some trusts that were good, that benefited the United States, but the bad trusts were the ones that were bad for the U.S. overall. So it wasn't that all trusts were bad, it was that certain ones that exploited the nation's resources, exploited the nation's workers, etc., etc. And it was the bad trusts really that should be broken up for this reason. Roosevelt was also really good at using what was called the bully pulpit, and this might be the what we might call the media. He often took to newspapers, for example, made speeches in order to bully companies into doing what he wished, and oftentimes this meant taking on the very rich and very powerful. Another good example of Roosevelt's willingness to take on big business happened in 1902 when coal workers went on strike. Unlike previous presidents, which had pretty much only favored the side of business, Roosevelt intervened. And at least, we might not say that he sided with the workers, but he took a neutral position. And in fact, from this strike, workers saw an improvement as a result. You had never had a president, we might say just from this, just to make things simple, first time a president sided with the workers, right? All throughout the Gilded Age, whether it was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 or whether it was the Pullman strike of the Pullman strike of 1894, that whenever the federal government got involved, it always sided with the interests of business. Now Roosevelt became the first president to side with workers, even though he was more of a neutral position. So, he was something new in his willingness to take on big business and centers of concentrated economic power. Roosevelt called his progressive agenda the Square Deal. So this is Roosevelt's. You might want to distinguish Teddy Roosevelt. He was called Teddy. His nickname was Teddy Theodore Roosevelt. Later on, there's another Roosevelt as president. It can sometimes be confusing. So Teddy Roosevelt's progressive agenda. And he called it the Square Deal because he said that all sides involved ought to have a square deal. And like a square, that meant even on all sides. So when it came to, for example, the interests of business versus labor, Roosevelt just wanted to make sure that both business and labor were getting equal terms, like a square, equal sides. No side was favored over the other. So in addition to his willingness to take on big business, Roosevelt also offered protection to consumers. This came in the form of two different laws, the Meat Inspection Act and the Food and Drug Act. Both of these laws were inspired by Upton Sinclair the Jungle. Upton Sinclair was a muckraker author, right? So he was one of these individuals dedicated to bringing awareness to the issues presented in Gilded Age society. He wrote a book called The Jungle, which was to expose working conditions in meat factories, right? So what he wanted to do was to create reforms that would make it easier for those who are working in the meat factories, make it less dangerous, higher pay, etc., etc. However, when his book was published, people paid actually very little attention to the working conditions and instead paid attention to the food itself. What Upton Sinclair revealed was that the meat that was being produced in these factories was disgusting. It was rotten, that there were dead animals that were going into like the sausage and stuff like that. And, Sinclair famously said, I had aimed, or I wanted to reform people's minds, but instead I hit them in the stomach and made them nauseous from reading this book. And so Roosevelt was one of the people who read The Jungle, and this spurred action. He passed the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. That is federal inspections for meat, again, to make sure that there's no dead animals and all this other stuff, gross stuff that Sinclair talked about in his book going in there. He also helped pass the Food and Drug Act, which 1906, which required food and drugs to label / list all ingredients. Right, that before, essentially you had these companies that were producing food and drugs and tonics and medicines, and they just lied about what the ingredients were. The Food and Drug Act made that illegal so that you had to list what was inside of those products on whatever product that was. So both of these things fall under this umbrella of consumer protection, right? Looking out for the little guy, so to speak. Roosevelt was also in part of his Square Deal, and part of its progressive reform was his reform to public land. Roosevelt might be also one of the first major presidents concerned with the environment. Now, he was concerned with the environment in kind of a different way. Roosevelt wanted to conserve natural resources. That during the Gilded Age, timber companies, oil companies, mining companies, they were simply too big and too efficient, and they were gobbling up all the nation's land. Roosevelt wanted to set aside some land and protect it to make sure that no businesses could go in there and mine for ore or dig for oil or cut down all the trees, etc., etc. Roosevelt helped to establish the U.S. Forestry Service, and during his presidency protected 230 million acres of land. So this was under protection of the government, meaning that that land, 230 million acres, that land could not be commercially mined. You couldn't build railroads through it. You couldn't build an oil well on it. And again, the purpose was to conserve those national resources, perhaps for another time. This is a picture of Roosevelt. I believe this is actually the Yosemite Valley, I want to say. That's John Muir of the Sierra Club right next to them. The Sierra Club was the premier conservationist group and organization during the Gilded Age. So Roosevelt had a lot of things going for him in terms of his progressive agenda, right? When it came to his Square deal, it included, busting up the trusts. The Northern Security Company was broken up, siding with workers in the 1902 coal strike. It involved consumer protection with Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act, and it also meant protecting national land. After 8 years in office, because he was a popular president, he handed the baton off to William Howard Taft, who was meant to succeed Roosevelt as kind of his hand-picked, we might say hand-picked progressive successor. All right, so William Howard Taft was supposed to be Roosevelt's hand-picked successor and continue this legacy of progressive agenda. However, during the Taft presidency, progressives felt betrayed by Taft, that he wasn't a true he wasn't a true progressive, even though he actually did break up more companies than Roosevelt did and actually has a pretty good progressive record. It was more the perception of him, and there were two things that Taft did or that happened during his presidency that made progressives turn on him. One had to do with tariff rates, that is, he raised tariffs. Recall that tariffs were synonymous with business, so if you raise tariffs, that essentially means that you are favoring business. If you lower them, you're favoring consumer. And there was a scandal in which federal lands were sold to private companies. Again, both of these feeling like betrayals. And so when Taft served his 8 years from 1908 to 1912, when it came time for his re-election, Teddy Roosevelt came back under a new political party, the Progressive Party. So a third party. This is in addition to the Democrats and Republicans. All right, Republicans ran Taft. He was already president. Theodore Roosevelt had tried to get the Republicans to nominate him, but they wanted to go with the incumbent president instead. And so when the Republicans rejected Teddy Roosevelt, who again was represented these betrayed progressive constituents, said, look, I'm going to make my own party, the Progressive Party. This party was also called the Bull Moose Party. You can see this illustration of Teddy Roosevelt's face on a bull moose. That term came from an attempted assassination against Roosevelt in which he was shot. He was shot during a speech, actually. He continued to give a speech and said, it would take more than an assassin's bullet to kill a bull moose. And so they called Roosevelt's Progressive Party the Bull Moose Party. So this is Teddy Roosevelt. With the Republicans split between half wanting Roosevelt, half wanting Taft, the Democrats ran Woodrow Wilson. So he was the Democrat that was running in the 1912 election. And Wilson, too, was a progressive, right? He still wanted a progressive agenda. So you had three progressive presidents. And really the way that the election played out was Taft really just kind of faded to the background. He didn't seem like he wanted the job so much. And so it really became a contest between Wilson and Roosevelt. And they had two competing ideas, new freedom versus new nationalism. So we'll go ahead and let's do blue for, or no, actually Woodrow Wilson's a Democrat. We'll do, blue for new freedom. This was Woodrow Wilson's idea, more or less what freedom advocated. Again, was a progressive position, but small federal government. And you might be able to read into this because Woodrow Wilson was also from the South, which voted very solidly Democratic at the time. Meanwhile, Teddy Roosevelt, and maybe we'll use yellow to represent a third party, the Progressive Party. Nationalism, or new nationalism, meant a strong national government. All right, so when we think about the issue specifically of federalism, right? Federalism is between the states and the national, or let's use federal, national. Essentially what both sides advocated for was that, Teddy Roosevelt said, look, it's got to be the national government, the whole United States, that puts forward these progressive reforms, whereas Wilson said, yes, the reforms are good, but, maybe let's leave a little bit more up to the states. And when things were all said and done, when the election had taken place, Woodrow Wilson ended up winning. And when he became president, he enacted a lot of various progressive reforms. The Revenue Act, or the Underwood Tariff, lowered tariffs, right? Recall that during Taft, he had raised tariff rates. Wilson, turned the course on that and went to lower them. The 16th Amendment allowed for a federal graduated, I call also progressive, income tax. Because one thing that tariffs did too, we got to recall, tariffs were the primary way for the United States to raise money, right? The tax on imported goods, yes, it protected businesses, but it also led to revenue. And especially if you're going to have a government that does more things to help people, that inspects factories, that protects private land, you need to have more money to do that. So if you lower tariffs, you're getting rid of, some of this money. Well, where are you going to get that extra money from? Well, you're going to get it from the 16th Amendment, which is going to create an income tax and raise more revenue. So you can think of the income tax as a replacement for the tariffs. And ever since then, actually has become the main source of revenue for the federal government, even to this very day. The Federal Reserve Act was created. This was a central bank. Again, all this happening under Wilson. This could regulate monetary, that means money, policy, control the amount of money that was in circulation. This was done to avoid the boom and bust economy of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age experienced a lot of different depressions. The Depression of 1873, the Depression of 1893. You actually had some depressions in the early 1900s. It was very characteristic for the economy to boom and bust very frequently. By creating a Federal Reserve, you could control the money supply, hopefully avoid the economic depressions. And also Woodrow Wilson, the Clayton Antitrust Act, which really doesn't need any sort of explanation. Again, antitrust, much like Roosevelt taking on the trust. This was to replace the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in the 1890s, but was really weak. So this made that a lot stronger. Now, when Wilson ran for re-election in 1916, the issues of progressivism were becoming more and more irrelevant. And that was because something we'll talk about in a different chapter, World War I. And as soon as World War I broke out, issues regarding progressivism began to fade a little bit more to the background. And instead, the war, or the war to end all wars, as they called it at the time, became a much more important issue in which Woodrow Wilson would, exercise his power as the president on.